Hey there, before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let your mind drift. These horror stories will crawl under your skin and linger in the dark. Let's begin. I never believed in mountain superstitions. Growing up in Asheville, I'd heard enough old-timers talk about not whistling after dark, or never walking off trail after sundown. But when you're a teenager, everything sounds like a campfire ghost story. It wasn't until a solo camping trip in late October that I understood why locals speak with hushed voices when they talk about the deeper parts of the Appalachian range. I had just turned 24 and needed to clear my head after a rough breakup. I packed my gear, picked a secluded trail off the Blue Ridge Parkway, and hiked out farther than I'd ever gone before. The idea was simple: one man, a tent, a fire, and no distractions. By early evening, I had my tent set up and a fire going. The sun dipped behind the mountains quickly, and the air grew cold and damp. I was used to that. What struck me as unusual was how silent everything became after dark. The usual sounds of insects and birds just stopped. No rustling leaves, no distant hoot of an owl, just dead silence, like the woods had taken a breath and were holding it. Around 10 p.m., while sipping from a metal flask, I heard what sounded like soft humming coming from the trees behind my tent. It wasn't wind, it wasn't water. It was low, tuneless, and close. I turned off my headlamp and crouched near the fire, waiting. The humming stopped after about a minute, and I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe the wind really was playing tricks through the branches. But around midnight, I woke up to something even more unsettling. I had zipped myself snug in my sleeping bag, but the tent was freezing, and I could see my breath in the air. My skin prickled when I realized I could hear crunching leaves just outside. Then, silence again. I stayed awake until dawn. By morning, there were no footprints outside. The ground was covered in thick layers of leaf fall, so I told myself it might have been a deer, or maybe I was dreaming. Still, the silence in the woods lingered. Even the birds hadn't returned. Something wasn't right. I debated hiking back out, but I was stubborn. I told myself one more night, then I'd leave. I spent the day exploring up one of the nearby ridges and came across something unexpected: a structure. Not a cabin or an old shack, but what looked like a circle of stones, maybe 6 feet in diameter, set perfectly in the ground. In the middle was a wooden carving, almost like a totem, no taller than my knee. It was weathered, cracked, and covered in moss, but the wood had strange carvings I couldn't read. I should have left right then. Every hair on my neck told me to turn around and get out. But I took a photo and went back to camp, trying to laugh it off. That night, the woods came alive again, but not with animals. Around 11 p.m., I heard whispering, multiple voices, low and dry, like old leaves brushing together. They weren't speaking English. It sounded like an old dialect, or maybe something older. I stayed in the tent, flashlight off, clutching my knife with both hands. The whispers circled the camp like the footsteps had the night before. No lights, no figures, just sound. Suddenly, something thumped hard against the side of my tent. I yelped, scrambled to unzip the flap, and shined the flashlight outside. Nothing. No wind, no movement. But on the ground in front of the tent flap was a single stone flat oval and freshly cleaned of dirt. It looked just like the ones from the circle I'd found. I tossed the rock as far as I could and stayed awake again till sunrise. When light broke, I started packing up. I didn't care how far I had to hike. I was done. I was nearly finished stuffing my gear when I noticed something on the side of a nearby tree. It wasn't there the day before. Etched deep into the bark was a symbol, 2 concentric circles with jagged lines breaking through the edges, just like one I'd seen on the wooden carving. I didn't take time to think. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started hiking out. The woods seemed darker even during the day. Every few minutes I stopped to listen, half expecting to hear the whispers again. The silence followed me, another symbol, freshly carved. I turned around to look behind me and swore I saw someone move between the trees. And then the humming started again. The humming wasn't just behind me now. It drifted through the trees from both sides of the trail, weaving through the branches like smoke. I couldn't tell where it started or where it was coming from. It was just there, as constant and cold as the mountain air. My legs started moving before I even told them to. I wasn't walking anymore, I was fleeing. I didn't run outright. I knew better than to sprint blindly through the woods, especially alone and carrying gear. But my pace quickened with every step. The old-growth forest on either side of the path now felt like the walls of a tunnel, pressing in on me, tall and ancient and not entirely empty. The humming followed at my heels, always a few steps behind, like someone walking just out of reach and not trying very hard to hide it anymore. When I passed the same ridge I'd hiked down 2 days earlier, the silence began to break, but not in the way I'd hoped. The wind picked up, sharp and sudden, blowing down from the peaks above with a noise that was almost human. Not words, but shapes of breath and air that rose and fell like someone whispering into my ear from a few inches away. I stopped in my tracks. My heart hammered so loud I could barely hear myself think. Something moved ahead. It was a figure just at the edge of the trail. Not a shadow, not an animal, a person. At least that's what I told myself in the moment. The figure was tall, thin, and still. No face I could make out, no clothes I could identify. Just something dark and standing in the middle of the woods, like it had been there all along. I stepped backward, and it didn't move. I blinked, and it was gone. I don't remember making the decision to run, but I remember running. My legs were burning, lungs tightening, pack slamming against my back. I didn't stop until I could see the signpost for the trailhead through the trees, half rotted and leaning sideways. My truck was still there, covered in dust and pine needles, but untouched. I didn't feel safe until I was halfway down the mountain and could see other vehicles passing on the highway below. But even then, something didn't sit right. When I stopped for gas 2 hours later, I noticed the stone again. It was sitting in the back seat, the same smooth, flat stone from the night before. I know for a fact I threw it deep into the woods, but there it was, resting on the back bench, like it belonged there. I stared at it for a long time, then picked it up and hurled it into the trash can near the pumps. I made sure it landed at the bottom, buried under snack wrappers and crumpled paper. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel on the edge of town. I didn't want to be alone in the woods. I didn't even want to be alone in the truck. But when I pulled the curtains shut in the motel room, I saw something out the window that made my stomach turn. Across the parking lot, written in the condensation on the window of the next room over, was the same symbol, 2 circles, jagged lines cutting through the edges. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I drove straight home and made a promise to myself to never return to that part of the mountains again. For the first few weeks, I felt like the experience would fade, like a nightmare you eventually forget. But then things started happening around the house. I would wake up in the middle of the night and hear humming in the hallway. My dog, normally calm and friendly, refused to enter my bedroom and stared at the door like someone was standing behind it. I started finding small piles of dirt near the corners of the living room. Once, I found a single black feather on my pillow. I don't own any feathered bedding. I don't even own any black clothing. I went back to the photo I took of the wooden carving in the woods, hoping to find some clue or detail I'd missed. When I opened the image, my heart nearly stopped. It had changed. Or maybe I never noticed it before. Behind the carving, almost invisible in the shadows, was a shape, a figure, tall and still, half hidden behind a tree. I zoomed in as far as I could, and the shape became clearer. Not just a person, the same figure I'd seen on the trail. I deleted the photo, wiped my phone, and tried to forget. But deleting something digital doesn't erase it from your mind. I started researching Appalachian folklore. I learned that what I had stumbled into wasn't just a coincidence. The region is steeped in ancient stories of the hidden ones, beings that live in forgotten corners of the mountains and resent those who stumble upon their spaces. According to some of the older legends, they don't speak, they hum. I moved out of Asheville a few months later. The house felt wrong. My friends thought I was just going through a rough patch, and maybe I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something back with me from the forest. Something old, something quiet, something patient. The last time I saw the symbol was about a year after the trip. It was carved into the tree outside my new apartment window, 4 states away. The humming had stopped for a while, but sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I hear it again, very faint, just outside the walls. Story 2. I was never supposed to camp there overnight. The plan was to hike up, fish the river until dusk, then head back to the car before dark. But the Appalachian weather had other ideas. A sudden storm came in from the west, hard and fast, catching me miles away from the trailhead. By the time I realized I wasn't going to make it back down, the path had turned to mud, and the sky was as black as slate. I had been hiking alone near the Chattahoochee section of the Appalachians, where Georgia starts to press against North Carolina. It was early April, warm during the day, but cold enough at night to freeze your boots if you left them outside your tent. I was carrying enough supplies for a full day, but not for a night. No tent, just a tarp and a wool blanket I'd thrown in my pack out of habit. When I realized I needed shelter, I followed a small offshoot trail marked only by a faded piece of orange tape tied around a branch. I had seen it on my way in, maybe half a mile from the river bend. The path wasn't maintained, but it looked traveled enough, maybe by locals or hunters. I figured it might lead to an old cabin or shelter. What I found instead was a clearing with a collapsed lean-to and the remains of an old fire pit. The woods around that place felt different. I couldn't explain it then, and still can't now. The air was colder there than anywhere else I'd been that day. The trees, tall and thin, bent slightly inward toward the center of the clearing. It was subtle, but enough to make me feel like I had stepped into something untouched, something forgotten. But I needed shelter, so I used the remaining planks from the lean-to to prop up my tarp, made a rough windbreak, and settled in for a cold, wet night. The rain beat down hard for hours. I was curled up, wrapped in the wool blanket, trying to stay dry and warm. Every so often, thunder would roll down the ridges like distant drums. I remember dozing off sometime after midnight, my fire nothing more than glowing coals. I thought I heard voices in my sleep, the kind of thing your brain invents when it's half awake and freezing. But I woke up when I heard breathing. Real breathing. Slow, deep, heavy. It wasn't mine. I lay there under the tarp, not daring to move. I thought maybe a bear had wandered into camp. I had no food left out, but I knew animals didn't always care. The breathing was only a few feet away. I could feel the presence of something massive just beyond the edge of the tarp. I reached slowly for the small hatchet I had tucked into my pack. As my fingers brushed the handle, the breathing stopped, and then it spoke. A single word, whispered with a wet rasp, like it came from lungs filled with water. Cold. I froze. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe. I just waited, every muscle in my body locked. There was no other sound, no footsteps, no movement, just that one horrible word echoing in my ears. I stayed like that until dawn, too afraid to poke my head out. When daylight finally started to push through the gray clouds, I emerged from the tarp slowly, ready to defend myself. But there was nothing there. No tracks, no claw marks, nothing broken or disturbed. Just the faintest imprint in the soft ground near my head. A handprint, long, thin fingers, not human-sized, bigger. I packed up immediately, didn't even roll my tarp. I just shoved everything in my pack and bolted. I didn't even use the same path I came in on. I cut down the hill toward the sound of the river, not caring if I twisted an ankle or got soaked again. I needed to get out. But the forest didn't seem to want me to leave. Every few minutes, I'd hear a branch snap behind me. Not the usual squirrel or deer kind of snap. These were thick, deliberate breaks, like someone was snapping limbs off trees just out of view. At one point, I looked back and saw something move between two trunks, a flash of something pale and tall, much taller than me. I ran until I was gasping, knees soaked, and cut from falling more than once. When I finally reached the river, I followed it until I found the main trail again. But something had changed. There were carvings in the trees, dozens of them, spirals, crude figures, and symbols I didn't recognize. They hadn't been there the day before. I'm not the kind of person to scare easy, but my hands were shaking. I kept moving, half jogging the last few miles to my truck, not stopping, even when my legs started to cramp. When I made it back to the lot, I was relieved to see my truck untouched. I drove for almost 20 minutes before I let myself cry. The shaking wouldn't stop. I didn't know what I had heard or seen, but I knew something had spoken to me, something real. I reported the collapsed Leonto to the forest rangers anonymously a few days later. They told me no trail was officially listed in that area. No shelter was ever built there, and no one had maintained anything in that part of the woods for years. I thought that would be the end of it, but 2 nights later, back home, I found dirt on my bedroom floor. Wet dirt, and beside my bed, pressed into the hardwood, was the faint outline of a long-fingered handprint. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I turned off the lights, I'd imagine that slow, rasping breath creeping up behind me again. That voice, cold and broken, seemed to echo in the back of my skull whenever things got quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint, finger-shaped smudge on the floor. The print was too large to be mine, too thin to be human. I took a picture of it, but the next morning, the photo wouldn't open, just a corrupted file, as if something didn't want the image saved. I cleaned the floor and tried to convince myself it was just dirt from my boots. Maybe I'd tracked it in during the unpacking, but I hadn't gone near the bed before showering and changing. The print hadn't been there when I went to sleep. I wanted to dismiss it all. I tried to tell myself the storm, the isolation, and the cold had all blurred my judgment. That maybe I'd imagined the voice. Maybe I'd been talking in my sleep and confused it for something else. But deep down, I knew better. A few nights later, I heard tapping on my bedroom window. It was light at first. Tap, tap, pause, then again, faster, like long fingernails or bones drumming against the glass. I lived on the second floor. There was no ledge, no balcony, no tree close enough to reach the pane. I refused to open the curtains. I just sat there, back pressed against the wall, waiting for it to stop. The next morning, there were streaks on the outside of the window. Not handprints exactly, but long, wide smears trailing down the glass. Like something with skin too smooth and fingers too long had pressed its hands against it. I started looking into the area where I had camped. I went deeper than weather reports or forest maps. I found local stories, forum posts, obscure Appalachian folklore collections. I eventually came across something that made my stomach turn. There were stories, mostly older ones, about a creature or presence known only in whispers. Locals never gave it a real name, only called it the pale cold. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't an animal. It was a watcher, something ancient, tied to places people weren't supposed to find. Places that had been buried or lost to time. It was said to follow those who came too close, said to mark them with a whisper. It didn't chase, it didn't kill right away. It lingered, waited, and eventually, when it was ready, it called them back. I started dreaming of the clearing every night. Not the moment I had camped there, but long before. Dreams of people sitting around a fire, dressed in old clothes, eyes sunken and mouths hanging open, not speaking, just breathing together in perfect rhythm, always in a circle, always around something I couldn't quite see. Something pale and still and massive, standing at the center, watching them like a shepherd among sheep. The worst part wasn't the dreams, it was waking up after them. Because every morning for a week, the smell of damp wood smoke would linger in my room. My clothes would be slightly damp, and once my hands were streaked with ash. I hadn't lit a fire since that night in the clearing. By the end of the second week, I stopped sleeping. I started staying with friends, switching locations every night. I left all the lights on, sealed windows, unplugged electronics, removed mirrors. I even went to stay with family down in Florida, hoping that hundreds of miles between me and those mountains would be enough. For a while, it worked. No dreams, no tapping, no handprints. Until the night my cousin knocked on my door, pale as a sheet, holding something in his hands. "I found this on the porch," he said. "Figured you dropped it or something." It was the same wool blanket I'd used in the clearing, the one I left behind in the tarp when I ran. I hadn't seen it since it smelled like rain and old wood. I burned it in the backyard, made sure it was reduced to nothing but ash. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. I could run, I could hide, but something had been set in motion that night on the mountain. I had heard the whisper. I had been marked. The dreams came back a few days later, Now I was standing in the circle, silent, breath in time with the others, and each night the pale figure at the center was just a little bit closer. I'm writing this now from a motel off a lonely stretch of road in Alabama. No one knows I'm here. No one will find me if I disappear. But last night, as I walked to the ice machine outside, I saw muddy footprints on the carpeted hallway. They weren't from boots. They were bare, long, thin, slightly webbed at the toes. And when I turned to head back into my room, I swore I heard a voice just behind my shoulder. Not a growl, not a shout, just that same wet, broken whisper, cold. Story 3. We should have turned back when we saw the first tree. It was late October when my friend Eric and I decided to camp along the Appalachian Trail section near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. The leaves were at their peak, burning orange and red, and the mountain air had that crisp bite that makes you feel more alive. We were experienced hikers, both of us having spent years exploring different parts of the Appalachian Range, but that trip was meant to be the last before winter. One final weekend under the stars before snow started to settle on the peaks. We planned to set up camp deep in a remote patch between Clingman's Dome and Mount LeConte, far from shelters or heavy foot traffic. The trail was steep, switchbacking through groves of spruce and fir, then opening up into a less traveled ridge that dipped into what locals called Bear Hollow. There was no marked path on the maps, but old hikers online had mentioned it. Some warned against going too far, and most just said it was beautiful, quiet, untouched. That was what we wanted. We reached the hollow just before dusk. That's when we saw the tree. It wasn't broken or fallen. It stood upright like the rest, but it had been stripped of its bark completely. Every inch of it, from the base to the top, exposed the pale wood underneath like a skeleton without skin. The bark wasn't on the ground anywhere nearby. The wood was smooth, not chewed or clawed, and didn't look dead. It stood in perfect silence, untouched by wind, surrounded by normal trees, as if nothing was wrong. Eric joked that it looked like the forest had peeled it alive. I didn't laugh. We found a clearing near a creek and set up camp. The air was colder than we expected, so we built a fire early and settled in with whiskey and freeze-dried chili. The stars were stunning. I remember thinking how lucky we were to be so far from the cities, away from headlights and noise. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something pacing outside our tent. It wasn't fast or frantic, just slow, deliberate steps, crunching leaves and breaking twigs. I thought maybe a deer had wandered near camp, so I whispered to Eric to grab the flashlight. He was already awake, said nothing, just handed me the light. When I unzipped the tent and pointed the beam into the woods, I saw nothing. The sound had stopped. I stepped out, keeping the light low, scanning the trees. The night was dead quiet, too quiet for the time of year. No crickets, no wind, just our fire, smoldering to glowing embers. Then I saw them, dozens of them, trees stripped of bark, just like the first one. Every one of them, pale and smooth, rising like bones through the forest floor. They were all in a rough circle around the clearing. None had been like that when we arrived. I was sure of it. I called out to Eric, but when I turned around, he wasn't at the tent. The flap was open, but he was gone. I felt panic rise in my throat. I called his name again, louder this time. No answer. I started toward the creek, thinking maybe he'd gone to relieve himself. But I didn't get more than 20 steps before I saw the footprints. Bare, human-shaped, but the proportions were off. The toes were long, the arch too high. They were sunk deep into the soft earth, going away from the creek, deeper into the hollow. I followed them, heart pounding, flashlight shaking in my hand. After maybe 5 minutes, I saw a faint light up ahead, a lantern, old-fashioned and swinging slightly as if hanging from a branch. I approached cautiously, calling Eric's name again. He didn't answer. When I reached the light, I found him, standing perfectly still in the middle of another circle of stripped trees. He wasn't tied up or restrained, just standing with his arms at his sides, facing one of the trees, breathing shallow and slow. His eyes were open, but he wasn't blinking. He didn't respond to my voice, even when I shook him. It was like he was under some kind of trance. His skin was ice cold, and then I heard it, the whispering, not from Eric, not from the trees, from the ground, like a chorus of voices buried just beneath the soil, whispering words I couldn't understand. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, murmuring in a language older than anything I'd ever heard. It filled my ears like wind through a cave. I grabbed Eric by the shoulders and yanked him back hard. He stumbled, blinked, looked at me like he didn't recognize me. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He pointed behind me. When I turned, there was something standing at the edge of the trees. I only saw it for a second before the light flickered out, but I know what I saw. Tall, thin, gray-white skin that matched the stripped trees. No eyes, just deep hollows in a face stretched too long, as if it had been carved from bark. Its arms hung low, almost to the ground. It didn't move, it didn't breathe, it just stood there. We ran. I grabbed Eric and ran as fast as I could back toward the camp. The forest seemed to shift around us. The path twisted, trees closer together than before. I lost my bearings but kept running, driven by raw fear. We didn't stop until the sky began to lighten. We never found our camp, never found the trail again. We wandered for hours until a group of day hikers found us and led us back to a ranger station. We didn't say much, just claimed we got turned around and camped too deep. The rangers seemed skeptical but didn't press. Later that night, at a motel off the highway, Eric finally spoke. He said he didn't remember walking away from the tent, but he remembered the voices. He remembered the way the earth felt warm beneath his feet, like something breathing just beneath the surface. He said it called to him, but not with words, with hunger. And then he said the worst thing. They weren't trees, he whispered. They looked like trees, but they weren't. They were skin, tight, wrapped around bones. I haven't been back to the Appalachians since. For the next few months, Eric didn't talk much about what happened. He stopped replying to texts, ignored phone calls, and when I visited him once in Knoxville, he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. The circles under his eyes were dark, his hands trembled, and he kept his curtains closed, even during the day. When I asked if he was okay, he just nodded. But before I left that night, he pulled me aside and whispered something that stayed with me. It's still whispering, not all the time, just when I'm alone, or when I close my eyes. He was pale, sweating, gripping the doorframe like he expected it to move. I told him to get help. He said he tried. Therapists, priests, doctors, none of them helped. One of them actually told him not to return. Told him that part of the mountains had stories older than written history, that sometimes the earth remembers things people should have left buried. A week later, Eric went missing. His car was found in a trailhead parking lot near the same section of the Appalachians, same region where it all started. Inside the vehicle was a note written in his journal, just one sentence repeated over and over again. They called me back. The rangers mounted a search, but after 10 days they found nothing. No trail, no tracks, no gear. The forest didn't give him back. I couldn't rest after that. The guilt was too heavy. I kept thinking about what he said, about how the trees weren't really trees, about the circle, about that figure standing still and silent, watching us. I started researching again, deeper than before. I dug through Appalachian archives, university folklore departments, even forums with more superstition than sense. Most of it was cryptic, half-baked myths and scattered personal stories. But some pieces started to connect. There were stories of people who vanished in clusters in that part of the mountain range. Not many, but always in or near areas that had no official trails. Stories of campsites found with cold fires still burning, tents undisturbed, personal items left behind, and not a trace of the people who were there. One story from the 1970s described a family camping near a ridge who woke up to find their son missing. When they looked for him, they discovered a ring of trees with smooth, pale trunks, ones that hadn't been there the day before. The boy was never found. Another came from a park ranger in the 1990s who claimed to hear whispers while patrolling alone. Said he followed a light through the trees and came upon a circle of stripped trunks. He never went back. Most of these stories were dismissed. Locals chalked them up to hysteria, exaggeration, or mental illness. But I knew better. I had seen it, heard it, felt the pull of whatever was buried in that hollow. It started calling to me, too. At first, it was dreams, always the same. I was standing in the clearing, alone, surrounded by the pale trees, something behind me, close enough to feel its breath, never speaking, just watching. The sky was always gray, no sun, no birds, just that endless whispering. Then came the sleepwalking. I woke up once in my own backyard, barefoot, standing in the middle of a circle of rocks I didn't remember placing. My feet were wet with morning dew, and the grass around me was pressed flat like something had stood there with me. I stopped sleeping after that. I started marking the days I felt the pull. It was strongest near the end of each month, like the moon tugged not only at the ocean, but at whatever lived under the soil in that part of the world. Every time I felt it, my thoughts turned toward the trail, toward that hollow, toward Eric. I fought it for as long as I could, until last week. I'm writing this now from a small cabin I rented 10 miles from Bear Hollow. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just firewood and silence. I didn't come here to hike or camp. I came here to see if I could end this. Earlier today, I found it again, the clearing. It took hours of hiking, through paths overgrown and forgotten, guided more by instinct than memory. When I reached it, the pale trees were waiting, a perfect circle. No birds, no wind, just stillness and the low hum of something that wasn't sound, but something deeper, like pressure in your bones. At the center was Eric's pack, weathered, molded, his water bottle half full, as if he had just stepped away. And there were prints in the dirt, bare feet, too long, leading to the center, disappearing into the roots. The whispering started again. Only this time, I could understand some of it. It wasn't calling me by name. It was calling me by feeling, grief, curiosity, guilt. It spoke to every hollow space in my soul and filled it with cold. But I didn't step inside the circle. Not yet. Tonight, I will stay in the cabin. I've sealed every door and window with salt, wrapped myself in iron, every old protection I could find in the books and forums. I don't know if any of it will work, but I have to try, because I know if I don't, I'll be back there by morning. And if I step inside the circle, I won't come out. They don't kill you. They don't even take you. They plant you, and when they strip you down, root you to that soil, you don't scream, you whisper, just like the rest of them. Story 4. It wasn't supposed to be an overnight trip. In June of 2003, I was working for a local conservation group out of Boone, North Carolina. We were helping document invasive species growth along certain remote parts of the Appalachian Trail, especially areas with less foot traffic. I was assigned a one-day solo survey near the Roan Highlands, somewhere between Yellow Mountain Gap and Grassy Ridge Bald. I'd been out that way before, though not alone. It was beautiful countrywide open meadows, tall pines, and long stretches of solitude that didn't feel threatening, at least not back then. I packed light, just water, a GPS, a topo map, a notepad, and a lunch. The day was supposed to be dry, no storms forecasted, so I didn't bother with a tent or sleeping bag. I planned to be back by dusk. Around midday, clouds started rolling in, fast and heavy. I was documenting fern overgrowth in a narrow draw when the temperature dropped sharply. I barely had time to react before thunder cracked hard and sudden above the ridgeline. My GPS started acting upscreen, blinking in and out, bouncing between coordinates. I tried my backup compass, but the needle was jittery, like it couldn't find north. By then, the rain had already started. Not just a drizzle, but a cold, pounding downpour that soaked me through in minutes. I grabbed a rain poncho from my pack and took shelter beneath a low overhang of rock just off the trail. I waited for the worst of it to pass, but after an hour, with no sign of clearing, I realized I'd lost too much daylight to get back safely. I had to find somewhere dry to hunker down until morning. The trail had turned slick and hard to follow. Even though I knew the map by heart, I'd somehow passed the same cluster of mossy stones 3 times. The trees didn't match the ones near the ridgeline, I realized. Then, I wasn't just off traily, was somewhere I'd never been before. That's when I noticed something odd. In a small clearing ahead, there was a structure. It was a single-room cabin, squat and crooked, made of rough-hewn logs, so blackened with age they looked charred. The door hung slightly open, just a gap wide enough to suggest recent use. There were no windows, no smoke from a chimney, but something about it gave me pause. The air around it felt still, heavier than the rest of the forest, but the temperature was dropping, and I was starting to shiver. I stepped inside. The interior smelled like damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. It was empty, aside from a cot with torn blankets, a rusted stove, and an old lantern sitting in the corner. The floorboards creaked underfoot, soft in places, and the walls were carved, not with initials or dates, but deep, jagged symbols, rows of circles, slashes. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of whispering just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it had stopped raining hours ago, and the trees were still. The sound was low and hushed, moving around the cabin in a slow circle. No footsteps, just voices, too soft to understand. I sat up slowly, heart thudding. I didn't turn on my headlamp. I didn't move. I just listened. The The whispers stopped. Then came a knock. 3 slow, hollow knocks on the door. Then silence again. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I waited for a sound of retreating steps, anything to show it was just a hiker caught in the rain. But there was nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and look out through the narrow gap in the door. The clearing was empty. I barely slept after that. At some point, I must have dozed off, sitting upright, because I woke again just before dawn to a cold blue haze creeping through the door. There were more than before, fresh ones, long vertical slashes, deeper than the others, carved right beside where I had set my pack. Some of them looked smeared, like someone or something had dragged their fingers along them while they were still being cut. I bolted, didn't bother eating, didn't even pack the camera. I just ran. The forest looked different again. The trees too close together, the trail indistinct, familiar and solid and real. But when I turned around, the clearing was gone. No cabin, no break in the trees, just endless forest, silent and still. I found my car an hour later, soaked and exhausted. I didn't report anything, didn't say a word to the team. I figured no one would believe me anyway. And maybe I convinced myself it was all stress, hallucination, bad weather, playing tricks. Until last year, when a hiker disappeared, not far from that same stretch of trail. An experienced solo backpacker named Hannah Mayfield. Her gear was found dry and undisturbed at a flat spot just off the ridgeline. Food untouched, camera missing, GPS scrambled. Only thing they found carved into a tree near her site were symbols. 3 long slashes, just like the ones I saw. I didn't want to get involved again. After all those years, I had done everything I could to forget what happened in that forest. I buried myself in work, moved out of the area, and never once set foot back on that section of the trail. But when I saw the article about Hannah Mayfield's disappearance, everything came flooding back. The picture in the paper showed a smiling woman in her late 20s, arms crossed in front of a well-used pack, standing at the same trailhead I'd left from all those years ago. According to the report, she had texted her sister from the summit of Round Bald on her second day, then vanished. Rangers found her gear, but no trace of her, no signs of struggle, no wildlife activity, no tracks leading away, just those strange carvings in a nearby tree. 3 deep slashes. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't sleep again. I kept dreaming about the cabin, the way the forest seemed to shift around it, the voices that whispered just outside the walls. And every time I awoke, the same thought clung to my mind: someone else was still out there, and they might still be alive. So I went back. I didn't tell anyone, just packed a bag, drove 6 hours from Asheville to the trailhead, and started walking. The sky was clear, the trail was dry, and despite the unease in my chest, the forest felt familiar in a way that stirred something like nostalgia. About 3 miles in, my compass began to shake. The needles spun and twitched, then froze, pointing toward a dense stand of trees well off the main trail. It was a different route from where I'd gone all those years ago, but I trusted my instincts and followed it. The forest changed after about an hour. The air grew colder. The ground grew soft and springy underfoot, like I was walking on layers of old leaves that hadn't decomposed properly. I noticed the trees didn't look quite right. Their trunks bent at odd angles, and their branches stretched too far across the path, as if trying to keep the sunlight out. Eventually, I reached a clearing, not the same one I remembered. This one was smaller, tighter, almost strangled by the trees around it. In the center stood the same kind of cabin I'd found before dark, la-roofed, almost sagging under the weight of time. Its walls were covered in carvings, every inch etched with more of those same symbols: circles, spirals, slashes. This time, the door was wide open. Inside was empty, save for a burned-out lantern, a sleeping pad that looked recently used, and a strip of orange fabric likely from a backpack, strap-lying in the corner. There were no signs of blood, no signs of a struggle, just a presence that pressed in around me the longer I stood there, like something waiting. I turned to leave, but the forest had changed again. The path I came from was gone. There was no trail, no break in the trees, just thick underbrush, dense pine trunks, and silence. I called out once. My voice didn't echo. It just vanished into the air like it had been swallowed. I didn't panic, not at first. I followed the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of my trail. I marked trees as I went, dragging the edge of my knife along their bark, making sure I wasn't going in circles. But every few hundred feet, the carvings reappeared. Not mine, these were older, deeper, and they were warm to the touch, as if someone had just made them. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was wind, but the air was dead still. Not a leaf moved. The whispering sounded like breath in my ear, like dozens of mouths moving all around me. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I could feel what they meant. They didn't want me to leave. I turned and ran. I tore through the forest, branches clawing at my arms and face, feet sinking into the soft ground. The trees seemed to close in tighter the faster I moved, the sky above darkening, even though it was still early afternoon. Every few yards I passed another one of those slashes in the bark, still glistening with fresh sap, always 3 in a row, like something was following just behind me. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a dry creek bed. I followed it, uphill, praying it would lead to a break in the terrain, and finally, I saw it. Sunlight. I broke through a wall of brush and found myself back on the trail, the real trail. My legs gave out. I collapsed and didn't move for nearly 20 minutes, just lay there, gasping like I'd surfaced from deep underwater. Then I got up, and I didn't stop moving until I reached the parking lot. I didn't find Hannah, but I believe I found where she went. I contacted her sister anonymously and told her not to let anyone else go looking. I don't know if she listened. I haven't checked the news. I don't want to know if anyone else has gone missing. I only know this. There's something in those woods that doesn't want to be found. It lures people in, pulls them off the trail, and once it has them, it keeps them. Some part of me thinks the cabin isn't really a place at all. It's a door. And once you cross that threshold, you don't come out the same, if you come out at all. Story 5. I had only been in West Virginia for a few months when I heard about the Big Run. Locals talked about it in fragments warnings, mostly. A steep, rugged stretch of wilderness tucked within the Monongahela National Forest, bordering the more remote portions of the Appalachian Mountains. The name came from the narrow creek that twisted through the valley, but it wasn't marked on most maps. Rangers didn't maintain trails there anymore. People said it was too unstable, too prone to landslides and washouts. But the real reason they avoided it had less to do with nature and more to do with stories. Stories about lights moving between the trees at night, sounds that came from the ground, disappearances that were quietly buried in old newspaper archives. I didn't believe any of it. I was a freelance photographer at the time, trying to build a portfolio of untouched Appalachian landscapes. A ranger I knew mentioned the big run over drinks, described it like it was some forgotten Eden mossy boulders, overgrown trails, dead silence, the kind of place you could camp alone for a few nights and not see a single soul. It sounded perfect. I went out in late October, packed for 3 nights, just me, my camera gear, a tent, and the last stretch of fall sun warming the canopy. The trail in was barely visible. A few old blazes still clung to the trees, but it was mostly guesswork. I followed the sound of water until I found the creek. From there, I hiked upstream until the land opened into a hollow surrounded by steep ridges and massive stone outcroppings that jutted from the earth like crooked teeth. That's where I set up camp. The first night was uneventful, cold but peaceful. I built a fire, ate some dried food, and lay on my back, watching the stars between the skeletal branches. It was quiet in a way that made you feel small, not in a bad way, just aware of how far you were from anything man-made. But on the second night, I heard the clicking. It started after midnight. I had just crawled into my sleeping bag when I heard it, faint and deliberate. Click, click, click. Not like a branch breaking or an animal stepping, more rhythmic, like something tapping 2 stones together at regular intervals. I thought maybe it was a woodpecker, but it didn't stop. It moved to circled my tent slowly, just beyond the fire's dying light. I called out, "Hello." The clicking stopped. I waited. Nothing. Eventually, I unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight outside. There was no one there. The forest was dead still. No wind, no rustling leaves, just cold silence. I walked the perimeter of my campsite, but found nothing unusual. No tracks, no animals, no signs anyone else had been there. I went back to bed, but didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found something new. On a boulder near the creek, maybe 30 feet from my tent, someone or something had stacked 6 small rocks into a delicate tower, each stone perfectly balanced, the largest on the bottom, the smallest on top. I hadn't seen it the day before, and I would have. It was directly in my line of sight from where I'd eaten breakfast. I didn't touch it. Instead, I took a photo and hiked deeper into the hollow. I figured maybe someone had passed through before me and left it there. Maybe a marker or a harmless art project, the kind of thing backpackers do when they're bored. But 10 minutes down the trail, I found another one. Same structure, 6 stones, same formation. This one sat in the middle of a narrow game trail I was following, just perched there like it had been waiting. A chill crept down my back. It was too precise to be random, too intentional. Still, I pushed on. I didn't want to let superstition get the better of me. I reached a high bluff by late afternoon and set up my tripod to catch the last light. The shot turned out beautiful, gold streaming through the branches, mist rising from the valley below. It almost made me forget the night before. Almost. When I returned to camp just before dark, the first thing I saw was the stone tower from that morning. But now, it was inside my fire ring. I froze. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't been knocked over. It was standing perfectly straight, right where I had sat the night before. The ashes from the previous fire still dusted its base, which meant it had been moved there after I left, or while I was gone. I circled the camp with my flashlight, shouting now, convinced someone was playing a joke on me, but no one answered. and I didn't find any footprints in the soft soil around my tent, not even mine. That night, the clicking came back, faster this time, closer. I sat upright in the tent, holding my flashlight like a weapon. I could hear the sound moving back and forth, just outside, weaving between the trees. Click, 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 click. Then it stopped. Silence stretched on 4 minutes, long enough that I started to convince myself I'd imagined it, until something brushed the side of the tent. Not hard, just a light touch, like a finger running along the fabric. I spun, unzipped the door, and shined the light outside. Again, nothing, no footprints, no movement, just forest. But when I turned back, the stone tower was gone. Not knocked over, gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up the entire night, flashlight in hand, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. But just before dawn, as the first light crept over the ridge, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint, female, singing something low and slow, like a lullaby. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't close. It echoed off the rocks from somewhere deeper in the hollow. I stayed frozen in place until the sun was fully up, and that's when I saw the third tower. This one was right beside my tent, on a flat stone barely a foot from where I'd been sleeping. 6 stones, perfectly balanced, and on the top stone, drawn in charcoal or ash, was a symbol. 3 lines in the shape of an eye, watching, waiting. The symbol on the top stone burned itself into my mind, the eye. It felt like it was staring straight into me, as if whoever or whatever had placed it there wanted me to see it clearly. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, tracked by something unseen. I packed up my camp quickly and started hiking back toward the trailhead. My heart pounded with every step. The singing from the night before echoed faintly in my ears, and the silence around me suddenly felt heavy, almost suffocating. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind playing tricks or my imagination running wild. But then I saw the footprints. They weren't human. They were too large and oddly shaped, with long toes spread wide. The tracks circled my path several times, always keeping just out of reach, disappearing and reappearing like a game. I didn't dare stop or look back. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig felt like a warning. I moved faster, adrenaline flooding my veins. The sun was dropping behind the ridges, and I was still miles from the parking lot. Suddenly, a low growl cut through the silence. I froze. The sound came from the thick underbrush nearby. My flashlight flicked on instinctively, sweeping across the trees and rocks. Nothing moved. The growl came again, closer and more guttural. I didn't wait. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I pushed through the forest. The uneven ground threatened to trip me more than once, but I couldn't afford to fall. The growling followed me, fading slowly but never fully disappearing. After what felt like an eternity, I burst through the trees into the parking lot, gasping for air and soaked in sweat. The night was quiet now, peaceful almost. But I knew better. I left that night and never looked back. Months later, I learned from a local that several hikers had gone missing in the Big Run area over the last 50 years. They vanished without a trace, never found, despite searches and investigations. Some people believed the forest itself was cursed. Others whispered of an ancient guardian, something that didn't like visitors. I don't know what I encountered out there. I don't want to, but I still keep that photo of the stone tower, the one with the eye symbol. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear the clicking again, waiting. Story 6. I picked a spot near Shining Rock Wilderness in North Carolina, a place known for rugged terrain and beautiful views. The weather was perfect for October, crisp but sunny, with the smell of pine and decaying leaves heavy in the air. As night fell, I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat by the fire, watching the stars emerge like pinpricks in the dark velvet sky. It was then I heard the footsteps. The footsteps circled my camp once, then stopped. I held my breath and scanned the trees with my flashlight, but all I saw were shadows stretching and bending in the firelight. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just low, breathy sounds, almost like voices speaking in a language I had never heard. They moved around me, weaving through the trees, passing behind the creek, and then returning on the opposite side. I zipped up my tent and tried to calm my racing heart. There was nothing but darkness. Still, I could feel eyes on me, something unseen staring through the fabric. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing strange sounds, branches snapping, twigs crunching, the low whispers returning again and again. Small piles of stones had been arranged in deliberate patterns near the creek bank. Some were stacked carefully like cairns, others laid flat in circular shapes. I didn't see any animal tracks, no footprints at all, just those stones. And the whispers lingered in my mind. I packed up quickly, not wanting to spend another night. On my way out, I met a local hiker who warned me about the watchers in the wilderness. He said people disappear around there sometimes, that the forest protects itself. I didn't believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. That night in town, I found a small book in a used bookstore about Appalachian folklore. One story caught my eye, the tale of the old ones, spirits said to haunt the mountains. They watched travelers, marking them with stone symbols, and sometimes took them to another world hidden beneath the trees. I didn't know what to make of it, but I still have the photos I took by the creek, the piles of stones, the way they seemed to glow faintly in the firelight. And I still hear the whispers. I couldn't explain them, couldn't shake the feeling that something had attached itself to me in that wilderness, something ancient and silent, watching from the shadows. I kept the photos of the stones close, like a reminder of what I had encountered, or perhaps what had encountered me. I went back to the Shining Rock Wilderness, but this time I wasn't alone. I invited a friend, someone skeptical like me, to witness the place firsthand. I wanted proof that it was all just a trick of the mind, a story told by the wind and the trees. The air was colder now, the trees beginning to shed their golden leaves. As night fell, I told her about the footsteps, the whispers, and the stone piles. Soft footsteps circling our camp once again. She froze. I didn't say a word. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer. Then the whispers began, breathy, wordless murmurs that seemed to drift from every direction. My friend grabbed her flashlight and swept it around the trees, but the beam found nothing. No eyes reflected in the darkness, no shapes moving between the trunks. Suddenly, a chill ran through the air. The stones we had gathered for the fire were gone. In their place, small piles of rocks had appeared, arranged in strange patterns around our tent circles. Triangles, even crude symbols I couldn't identify. Panic set in. We packed up as quickly as we could. As we moved away from the creek, the whispers followed, fading only when the forest thinned and the moon disappeared behind the ridges. Back in town, I researched everything I could about the old ones and the strange symbols we had seen. I found references in obscure folklore to spirits guarding the mountains, marking trespassers with stone messages. Some believed these spirits existed between worlds, walking unseen in the shadows. Others thought they were remnants of ancient tribes or forgotten rituals meant to protect sacred land. I don't know what we saw that night, but since then, I have never camped alone in the Appalachians. I avoid places like Shining Rock Wilderness, and every time I see a small stack of stones by a trail or a creek, I wonder if it is a warning or a reminder that the forest is watching, that the old ones are still there, waiting.